Welcome everyone, this is Denver Noah's president of Wealth for Life. Today we're going to talk about asset protection, and we're lucky to be sitting down with one of the top asset protection attorneys in the country. His name is Ike Devji. He's been practicing asset protection for 16 years, protecting over $6 billion in personal assets, and truly one of the best experts in the country. Ike, thanks for being here and taking the time to chat.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
So I think one of the things that is so important, people don't often know the difference between estate planning and asset protection, and they think they're kind of doing the same things. But as people start accumulating assets, it becomes really important to make that distinction. Can you kind of go into that a little bit?
Absolutely. It's a great question, and it's a great place to start any conversation about asset protection. The biggest mistake people make in asset protection planning is always the same. It's doing nothing. And so we unfortunately turn down a number of people who call or who are referred to us every month. And that is because they are calling us after the exposure has occurred.
Right.
When we are legally prohibited as attorneys from helping them, and they are legally prohibited from fraudulent conveyance or voidable transaction statutes from taking the moves they could have taken. In many cases, the reason these folks get blindsided is because they are relying on traditional estate planning tools, typically what we would refer to as a revocable living trust, what many clients call their family trust. That trust is a vital estate planning tool, but that is the death plan, and it controls how your assets are distributed at the end of your life, to whom, with what tax treatment, etc., etc. It does not provide any protection for your assets from your creditors and your liability during your life, however. So we've got a whole bunch of people who are working hard, taking steps they believe are going to protect their wealth and their family, and leaving out the life planning portion, which is the asset protection portion.
Interesting. And I could see most people are just 100% in that. That doesn't even come on the radar unless someone's had that conversation of knowing about the difference.
Right. And I think that there's a big disconnect with what the public knows and sometimes what lawyers think.
Right.
The non-lawyers know. So a lot of folks do assume that because their property, their home, their investment property, their non-qualified investment account with their financial advisor is titled in the name of a trust, quote unquote, that it's protected when it really isn't, especially if it's a revocable trust. If it is an irrevocable trust, that may be a different story, and that's actually an asset protection tool we use, one of many. But these nuances are often lost in the discussion.
So now as we get into kind of the details of that, when would you say it's critical what you see in clients that they start adding those layers of asset protection? Is there a net worth level and an income level, and they reach a certain point, and then they need to add asset protection levels?
I think your question has a couple of different answers, and it's actually a few different questions, Denver.
Yeah.
So let's start with, are there financial benchmarks for certain tools to make sense? And the answer to that question is easy. Yeah, of course there are.
Yeah.
So for instance, somebody who wants to use a sophisticated structure like an offshore trust, for instance, as one of our bag of tools, one of the tools in our bag, should have liquidity that makes sense, right? We don't do that for somebody who's got $100,000 liquid. So we want to see 7 figures or more in liquidity to justify the cost of the trust, the cost of the accounting, to justify the fees that the offshore trustee and the offshore bank charge. All of those things need to make sense relative to the amount of money that we're protecting and the liquidity position of the person we're protecting. So if all they have is $1 million in this sort of artificial hypothetical, and we put all of it in that structure, well, that's not good for them. They need to remain solvent and have other assets. So yes, there are certainly benchmarks. On the other hand, there are also things that every single one of us should be doing and that we often don't. You would be surprised how many millionaires call me on an annual basis looking for help after they or a family member has been in a serious car accident and they don't have a 7-figure umbrella policy, for instance, on their home and their cars, which is one basic thing that anyone who drives a car should do to protect their wealth and their income, regardless of their current net worth position.
Right.
And it's very simple protection. For most adults who don't have a serious driving issue, like a DUI or something like that, it can be as little as $300 a year per million of umbrella coverage. So that is, a basic that everyone should have. Everyone should have high limits of personal liability insurance. Almost everyone should have some form of an estate plan. If you have income that you are receiving from multiple sources, you should have a way to receive that income. So for instance, tools like controlling how rental property income is received. That's a very common and popular investment where we are here in Scottsdale and in Arizona in general. I routinely talk to very smart, successful people who own 2 or 3 or 4 income producing real estate investments or more if that's their primary business. But I'm talking about maybe a doctor who owns 2 rental houses and an office building.
Yeah.
He or she should not be holding that property personally, where it is exposed to every med mal claim and car accident that could come along.
Right.
They should also, if they have been smart enough to put each of those properties in LLCs, for instance, not be the member of those LLCs, because then the income that comes out of those LLCs that is distributed to them personally is also exposed. So if I am suing you over a car accident, and you have 3 rental properties in LLCs, I can't take the LLC away from you, and I can't take the property in the LLC away from you since it doesn't have anything to do with my claim. The only thing I can take is the income when it comes out. Let's not make that mistake. So these tools, when we need them, which tools we need, are completely dependent on the patient's fact pattern, so to speak,
right?
Where we diagnose them and we look at, okay, you have your first 6 figures in savings, and that may be between a cash savings account and an investment account with someone like you and some CDs or whatever it is. And we put that together and we look at that and we say, okay, this is your sort of beginning nest egg. Should we put a safe around this? Should we give you a piggy bank within which to put this, within which you can continue to save and protect your wealth, and from which you can safely reinvest that wealth? So if I'm lucky enough to sell my business and get $10 million for it and want to give you some of that money to manage for me, you shouldn't be working for me. You should perhaps be working for the limited partnership where I've securitized that money.
Right.
Does that make sense the way I'm saying it?
Yeah.
So yes, there are benchmarks, but there are also some basics that all of us should do. And when we talk to people, we start with those basics and we get as sophisticated as they need.
Right.
But this planning, any kind of legal planning, should always be fact and need based. So anytime you hear sort of the prescription for you need this trust and this partnership and this many LLCs, without that person knowing exactly who you are, what you do, what your risks are, what your income is, and what you own, run away.
Right. Yeah, that makes me think of a conversation I had with a client the other day that was, and I'll give you the scenario because they had this very similar question what we're talking about. Clients making $1 million a year, has a W-2 income, has a gas station and some car washes and some other businesses as well, and was asking me, what's the difference between estate planning and asset protection? And is it as much as I just need to have a trust and fund it? And like we're talking about, that's what people think. It's like, oh, I just need to have my beneficiary designations here. Maybe I own have some properties in LLCs, but there is, like you're saying, a lot more nuance to it in those areas, right? And like, what would you tell a client like that is kind of getting started in that area?
Well, I mean, I think we start with the basics. So first of all, have we separated the properties from each other? And have we separated those investments from their owner and that person's personal and professional risk? So we would, as you said, perhaps set up those LLCs and then look at the next layer and see which other tools they need. That sort of foundational planning that you're talking about is very affordable. It's not exotic. And it is something that anyone who is making that kind of investment should factor into the cost of the investment if they want to keep it.
Right. Everybody thinks that kind of stuff is too cost prohibitive. when they go do that. But it's really, how much is it going to cost later when something happens, right?
Yeah, and look, everybody's risk tolerance is subjective, and everybody's willingness to spend on security, peace of mind, and predictability is also subjective. So we refer to what we do as attorneys who work in asset protection planning as net worth insurance.
Right.
I don't want anybody I work for to have to make the same money twice.
Right.
Right. Just like you don't with what you do as a financial expert. So, we're looking at how can we manage those risks, and a lot of the times the things that we talk about or ask people to do have nothing to do with us as attorneys. So I make people buy a ton of insurance, but I don't sell insurance, right?
Right.
But part of the things that I review with every business owner are the scope of their business coverage. Do you have employee lawsuit coverage? Do you have data breach coverage? Do you have D&O, directors and officers insurance, if you are the director or officer of a corporation with multiple members or that has solicited money from other people or things like that, right? And most people either don't know what they have, don't have the right coverage, or both. And so there, we've got to boil all of the risk management in with making legal recommendations.
Right.
Let's plan to keep you out of trouble in the first place, have insurance in place for when there's an accident or a mistake, and then have legal tools beyond that to limit our liability to that insurance plan.
Yeah, no, those are good points. And on the business side, I have a lot of business owners that listen and clients that own successful businesses. Those gaps you mentioned in coverage, what is the net result? Like, what are the problems that would come up or that you see common in the business where people don't have the right coverage for that?
Well, obviously, it leaves you personally exposed. That's the most basic problem, right?
Yeah.
So I alluded to the car accident issue earlier, right? So we have somebody who goes out, incurs a significant amount of liability that is in excess of the amount of coverage they have, and they're worth suing because they have assets that are available. Right? So why do attorneys, for instance, who are advancing a medical malpractice claim, sue the doctor for more than the $1 million that most doctors carry in malpractice coverage?
Because they can?
Because they can, and because the defendant has it.
Right.
Right? But if you were able to illustrate that the only assets available is the insurance coverage, because all of these other assets were segregated legally when we had the opportunity to do so, long before this claim ever was a dream on the horizon, then what we are showing to the plaintiff proactively is that there's some insurance available, and that's all that's available.
Right.
Right. So, and a lot of people don't realize that, especially on things like personal injury claims, the attorneys often become partners in that litigation. It's not the 33% you see advertised on TV. It's often 50% or more if it goes to trial. So they don't want to waste their time on an uncollectible defendant.
Right.
And if there is nothing available to them realistically except insurance, they will get as much from the insurance as they can and move on. So the first answer to your question is, don't be exposed for a judgment that's more than the amount of the coverage that you have in place.
Right.
The second problem is don't have assets exposed beyond the amount of coverage you have in place. The third issue that many people don't understand is how much coverage they should have. So, for instance, we'll go back to doctors just because they're easy to pick on.
Right.
It's an easy example. Most doctors carry a $1 million, $3 million policy, which means $1 million per occurrence, $3 million aggregate total policy value. And if they are fortunate enough to get an insurance agent who says, hey, you should have some data breach coverage for your practice in case you get hacked, or there's a HIPAA records exposure, or your patient's payment information is stolen, or something like that. What they will typically get is a rider on their medical malpractice policy of another $50,000, let's say, which is completely inadequate for the claims, right?
Right.
Or they'll have EPLI, which is Employment Practices Liability Insurance, that protects employers from employee lawsuits and employment-related claims.
Right.
They'll have the same thing. It'll be $50,000 or $100,000. Most of those standalone areas of coverage should also be $1 million, and they're surprisingly affordable. Another problem we see is that people not only don't know how much coverage they have, but they're unaware that the coverage they have shares the same limits with the base policy. So maybe if you're not aware of how your policy is structured, and let's say you have a bunch of coverage for an employee lawsuit. Let's say you have $500,000. Well, that $500,000 claim could eat into what's available for a medical malpractice claim.
Right.
For instance, right? So there's the shared limits issue, and I'm oversimplifying that,
Yep.
but I think for the purposes of our discussion, you get the idea. There are also things like defense inside the limits, which means that it used to be that with most policies, the insurance company would go out and spend whatever was required to defend you against the claim, and then you had the policy limits itself to pay for the claim.
Right.
The way some policies are structured, the cost of defense comes off your end. So if you have $1 million policy and they spend $300,000 fighting a lawsuit, that leaves $700,000, right? It came off your coverage. So all of those things can be surprises, right? It's not having enough coverage, not having the right coverage, and not understanding what the limits of your coverage are and how those limits are allocated by your insurance company. This means you need to, every person who's serious about protecting their wealth needs to work with an experienced insurance agent who will walk them through all of these details. And this isn't something you should just be price shopping online and buying from the cheapest vendor who'll sell it to you.
I agree. Yeah, I think you work with an expert who works in those areas, because insurance as the first line of defense is kind of what I'm hearing, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
And that's interesting. Again, you're an attorney, you do different things, but you have to talk about the first line of defense and that asset protection level.
Absolutely. And we also want that insurance in place at very heavy levels, if for no other reason, to catch the bullet on the legal fees. Yeah. Remember that the defense of a claim, a medical malpractice claim, an employee lawsuit, a contract dispute over a real estate development deal, just those legal fees can be hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Right.
Why should you be exposed to that if we can transfer that risk to somebody else for a finite amount of money? And that's part of the power of wealth. I hear this phrase that really always rubs me the wrong way, and I object to it, which is self-insured, which is about the dumbest thing I've ever heard. There is no such thing as self-insured. Either you are insured or you are uninsured. Yeah. And the power of having some money is that you can lay that risk off on the insurance company for a fixed price every year and worry about it much less.
Right.
And so most successful people who are well advised spend heavily on that coverage because the downside is so big.
Right. Yeah, I think most of the high net worth clients that I work with, what I hear is they just don't want to go backwards. They work very hard to get where they're at, and they just don't want to go the opposite direction.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, even here in Phoenix and Scottsdale, we saw the effects of the Great Recession. If we say it started in 2008, it lasted till at least, 2014? Mm-hmm. We saw some of the most expensive neighborhoods in town, property values drop by 50% or more. We saw the serial effect of having an economy that was based heavily on real estate and real estate development. And what happens when the mom and pops in the strip malls go out of business, and then the guy that owns the strip malls goes out of business.
Right.
So these things can and do happen. And unfortunately, a lot of those folks just aren't as well advised as your clients.
Right. Now, I think, when you look at that layer of protection, number one, you're looking at insurance. Then you go to level number two, which is looking at the legal structures and how your assets are allocated among those legal structures, right? That's step two. And that just has to be done on a case-by-case basis based on what each individual has, correct?
Yes, that really is the best way to do it. Otherwise, it's like walking into the doctor's office and saying, what's it going to cost to make me feel better?
Right.
Well, we don't know what's wrong with you.
Yep.
So it does need to be personalized, and it needs to be personalized, as I said, both for the legal structure and the risk management planning.
And you brought up some things earlier, though, some of the general things like if you have rental properties, if you need to look at legal structures, how you're receiving that income. If you have other businesses, how is everything titled, how is everything owned? Those are some of the basics that you want to be looking at within that legal framework, right? Are there anything else you'd add to that? I mean, those are common ones, but what other ones are common ones that people might not think of?
In terms of what questions we ask, or in terms of their risks, or what?
Yeah, I would say in the questions you ask, like when you're looking at asset pools.
Sure. Well, one of the first things that we look at is we start with the individual. So most of the people that I work with are wealth creators. Mm-hmm. The majority of them are first-generation wealth creators. They have built their business, their medical practice, their online sales company, their contracting company, whatever it is, they built it.
And you work with clients from the millions all the way up to the billions of dollars, right?
Yes. Yeah. The majority of the people that we work with have net worths between 2 and 50 million. Yeah. We've got plenty over 50, over 100, and a few billionaires. And we also work with a lot of people who are on their way, who are planning to be wealthy.
Right.
And planning to, as you said, keep that wealth and never take a step back. I teach doctors all over the country. I teach CME also, continuing medical education. And I always say my smartest clients are the guys or gals that come in here. They're 30 years old, and they come in here with their first tiny little bit of savings and $300,000 in student debt and a leased car and a watch they got for graduation. Yeah. And I say those are some of the smartest people I work with, because they are planning to securitize everything they earn now, whereas the majority of people I work with wait until they're already successful and wake up one day and say, oh my God, we better make sure nobody takes this, or that it's not exposed to everything else we're doing.
Well, I appreciate all the time and stuff today, Ike. I mean, again, you've just been a wealth of knowledge, and I think our listeners are going to get a lot out of that. How can they reach out to you if they want to talk to you about some issues?
Sure. There are a couple of different ways to reach me. I guess one easy way is through my my Arizona website, which is azwealthlaw.com. So azwealthlaw.com. And
you do practice nationwide, though, correct?
We do have clients in all 50 states and from about 14 foreign countries.
Okay.
And I have another website, which is proassetprotection.com. That one is focused almost exclusively on asset protection, and the Arizona one is a little bit wider in scope.
Okay, and I'll put the links to those in the show notes as well.
Absolutely. And we have a very well-developed archive of articles on these sites that are free for consumers. You don't have to sign up for anything or put your email in. You can just click on it and read it, and we're happy to share information. So almost every issue that you and I discussed today, there is a feature-length article on the website about it.
Yeah, I've seen your content. You have an amazing amount of content there for people that can really help, and it's, a lot of times people worry like, hey, I'm just going to have to call to get some basic advice. Well, there's a ton of it on the website. That can be a good starting point for people.
Yeah, it's a great start. And obviously, nothing, when you're looking at specific planning strategies or tools, nothing can compare with an individual consult, right? So nothing on the website can ever be specific legal advice to any individual situation, but it can certainly show you options and make you an informed consumer, whether it's knowing how legal tools work or what certain kinds of insurance will or will not do, or just avoiding scams. We've got all that information.
Yeah, that's great stuff. And as people gain knowledge, they get a little more empowered, and it makes them so they don't get taken advantage of, like you said, and gives them good information. Well, thanks, Ike, for being here, and I'm sure we'll talk to you again, and appreciate the time.
My pleasure. It's good to talk to you.